In this video, we'll look at how to write data out to a file. So we have some comments here which just says we're going to create a new file, and whether we're reading an existing file or whether we're creating a new one, we always have to open the file. And when we open up a file, we need to give it a name, and we need to have this file handle or this file pointer that we use to open up the file and to retain the pathway to that file. So I'm just going to call this out file. That's going to be my file pointer, and that's going to be equal to open. Remember, that's how we open up a file. Then we specify the location of the file. Now I'm going to use the complete path. You don't have to. If you just put the name of the file will be stored in the same folder as your program file. But I want to put mine on the C drive. So I'm running Windows, so C:/temp. And I'm going to call this student data, or just student, S-T-U-D-E-N-T. So it'll contain some student information, and it's a .txt file. After we put the name, then we also need to put a mode this time. When we opened up a file to read, we didn't have to do that because the mode was already set to a read option by default. But if you want to write to a file, we have to specify that we are doing a write option or a write command. So in that case, we have to put a W over here. Okay, so the W just means that we are in write mode. Now, there are some other modes that you can use. Let's go ahead and put a comment here. Okay, file modes. And there are 3. So let's put the first one down, and this is W, and that just means write to a file. And in addition to that, if the file happens to exist, if we have a file called student.txt already, this will overwrite that file. That's important to remember. So this would overwrite an existing file. So that's one way that we can create a file. The other mode that I just mentioned is when we're opening a file to read. We didn't have to actually put the mode here. It was by default an R. So if we use the mode R, then that means we want to read data from an existing file. Okay, so that's what the R mode does. Now, there's one more mode that we will look at shortly. I'll just put it in here now. It's called A, and that's to append to an existing file. Okay, so I'll talk about that a bit more when we get to it. So if you're going to open up a file, you have these 3 possibilities. You can open up a file to read from it, which means the file has to exist. You can open up a pathway to a brand new file, which is what I'm showing you now. And if you're writing to that file, you need to use the W option. And the other option, A, is an append, which means that you can open up an existing file, and instead of overwriting it with W, you can append the information to what's already in the file with the A mode. How do we input information? Have you seen how that's done? Well, maybe, maybe not. So let's take a look at how you can input data from the keyboard. So another comment. So read data from the keyboard. Okay, now what that means is you can type it in and your program will accept it. So here are the inputs that I'm going to use. The first thing I'm going to do is to spell from correctly. Now, to input data that you type in from the keyboard it's very simple. Suppose we want the first name. Then you just identify a variable. You write down a variable with an equal sign, which means you're going to assign some value to that. And if you want the data to come from the keyboard, then we use input. When you use input, you can also specify something to instruct the person to type in a particular type of information. So we can put a string here. And this is just going to say, enter your first name. Okay, enter your first name. I'll put a colon there. I'll put a space, and then I'll put a double quote and close the parentheses. So this will print to the screen, enter your first name. Then it'll move over a space then you can type in your first name and it'll be saved in the variable first name. So I'll do the rest of these and then I'll demonstrate how this works. So I'm going to copy this and I'll paste it down here. So I want to next ask for the last name. So last name is input, and let's change first to last. And let's input some other information as well. All right, so again, I'll copy and paste, copy and paste, and I'll do a couple more, and then I'll come back and edit those. So I want to input the first name, the last name, and then we're going to do the address. So let's input the address. That'll be the street address. So input your street name. That's going to go in here. Street name. Then let's input the city. Okay, city. So then enter your city. State is the next one. Enter your state. And then finally, let's do zip code. Okay, enter your zip code here. Okay, so zip code. Now, this will allow us to type in information that corresponds to these 6 things. Now, let's print those back out to the screen. So let's see them on the screen first before we write them to the file. So let's write the data to the screen. So we do that with print the same way we've been doing our other examples. So we do print, and I'm going to just print the first name and last name together. So let's do first name. Then we'll concatenate. I need to put a space between them, so double quote, space, double quote. Then we'll concatenate the last name onto that. Then close parentheses. All right, so that'll print out your first name and last name with a space in between. Then we will just print out the other stuff. Address, the city, state, and then we'll print out the zip code. And that will print everything back to the screen. I want to put a little bit of spacing between this output and what's going to follow. So I'm going to skip a line by putting a double quote, a backslash n, that goes to the next line. Then another backslash n will add another carriage return, which gives us a blank line. Now, let's run the program at this point, and I will demonstrate how the input commands work. Okay, so if I can get it over here, oh, there we go. So now we see the prompt, enter your first name. Well, that comes from this line here. Input, enter your first name, and when we type something in, that will be saved in the variable first name. So pretty straightforward. So let's put in some made up information here. Okay, so let's say Susan. Now enter your last name, Alan, again made up name. Enter your street name. So let's do 543 Spring Street. Enter your city. Okay, let's suppose that's in Athens. Enter your state, either AL or spell out Alabama. And the zip code is 35611 if it's in Athens. And then when I hit enter, everything is printed back to the screen. So the information that we typed in, Susan, Allen, that's on the same line, first name, last name. Then we get the address, we get the city, we get the state, we get the zip code. So all that comes from this part of your program. So now you can see that it's very easy to type in information from the keyboard. Just do it like that. Then we output everything back to the screen by using these print statements. Now then, let's write that same information to the file. Write the data to a file. Now, we can do this really easily. Instead of writing it out to the screen, we can write it to the out file by using the handle or pointer out file. So I will copy those 6 lines of output, and I'll paste them here. And everywhere I have print, which prints to the screen, I'm going to replace that with outfile. Dot write. Have to do the dot write. So it's outfile dot write. Now this goes in every case where we had a print, so I'm just going to copy it and I'll paste it over all of those prints. And also I will skip a couple of lines on the output file. So the information in parentheses is exactly the same whether you're printing it to the screen or whether you're printing it to a file. So we'll input the data here, we'll print it to the screen, then we'll print it to the output file. Now, as with files that we're opening to read data, whenever we're writing to a file, we should close it when we're finished. So let's do that. Outfile.close, empty parentheses, and that will close the output file. Okay, so now that will clean up the program and leave the file in a completed state. Now, I'm going to run the program again, and I'll go ahead and type in the information down to the point where I hit the enter, and I'm just going to pause the recording while I do that. So I typed everything in, I'll hit enter, and now we get the information back on the screen, and nothing happened down here when I wrote the output to a file. Okay, so we don't see it going to the file here. In order to see the file itself, we just need to go find the file and open it up. So here we go. I wrote this to the C drive, the temp folder, and up at the top you'll see a file called student.txt. This is the file we just created. Okay, I'm going to open it up. I'll double click and I'll bring up our output. So here in Notepad, you'll see we have the information, right? We have Susan, Allen, but then the actual name of the street is on the same line. Then so is the other stuff, Athens, Alabama, zip code. So all that's on the same line. And I didn't really want it to be that way. What I really wanted is for it to look the same as it looks on the screen. So on the screen, we had them on separate lines, as you can see here. So one difference between writing to the screen and writing to a file is that when we use write, it doesn't automatically put a carriage return at the end. When you do print to the screen, it does automatically put a carriage return after each print statement. So we need to go back to the code and we need to modify it a little bit so that we get line feeds in the file. Okay, so let's bring the code back over and let's modify our output to the file. So there are the lines that we used to write to the file, but we didn't write a carriage return. So we'll have to go to the end of each of these lines right before the parentheses, and we will concatenate a line feed. So that's double quote \n double quote. So we need that on every line in order to write to the file this carriage return, which makes us go to the next line before we output the item. So I'm just going to copy this since we need it everywhere. So I want to get the plus and the space and the \n, and I'll paste that into all of these other lines. So the address, the city, the state, the zip code, and this last one is just a couple of \n's anyway, so I don't really need to put another one there. So now when we run the program, you'll see that we do get this output in the file on separate lines. So again, I'm going to run the program and I'll type everything in, but I'm going to pause the video so you don't have to waste time watching me type. All right, so I've typed in all the information. I'll just hit enter, and now we get the information back on the screen. One item per line. And what does it look like in the file? All right, well, I'm going to go get the file again. Okay, I'll bring up the file browser. So here's student.txt. So I'll double click. It opens it up. And this time you can see that we do have each item's on a separate line. So when you're writing to a file, then you use the file pointer, which is outfile in this case, .write. And then if you want to go to a new line each time you do a write statement, then you do have to include the \n after each one. So now I have created an output file containing this student's information. So let's close this one and let's add something to our program. Now let's write data for another student to the file. So this wrote one student's information. So we can copy and paste some code in order to do another student. If we want to prompt to enter the information, then we can just copy this part of the code. We'll copy that and we'll paste it down here. Okay, so this will read data from the keyboard, let's say for student 2. So we have the same prompts again. Okay, so we'll prompt to the screen to enter the first name, last name, and all the other stuff. Then, after we've entered that information, we will write it out to the file. So I can copy what we just did, copy, and we can paste it in here. And we can write the data to a file for the second student. Okay, so we can do as many outputs as we want to. We just have to repeatedly ask for the input data, and then we write it to the screen. Okay, so now let's run the program, and we'll make a file that has 2 students. So we're starting over here. Alrighty, so I'll type in the first student, and again, I'll pause while I type that in. All right, so I've typed in the information. For Susan, I'll hit enter, and that's printed back to the screen. Then we have the prompt to type in the information for the second student. Okay, so let's make up a second student, and I'll make you watch me type this one in. So we have Phil Thompson, let's say, and let's suppose his street name is like 1145 Oak Street. And let's put him in Cullman, Alabama. And then let's enter the zip code, which 35056. Now, when I hit enter, then nothing comes back to the screen. This information is printed to the file for Susan, and that's printed to the screen. But when we entered the information for Phil, then we didn't print it back to the screen. We only printed it out to the file. Okay, so if we look at the code again, then you can see that we entered the data for the first student. We did print that to the screen. Then we wrote it to the file. Now we did a second student. So we just input the information and did not write it to the screen. We wrote it out to the file instead, and then we closed the file. Now, let's go look at the file this time. So now let's look at the file. Here's my file browser, and the name of the file is still called student.txt. So I'll open it up. And now you can see we have the information for 2 students. So we have Susan's information, we have the blank lines, and then we have Phil's information here. So we could continue this for as many students as we wanted, and it would just be appended further down the file as we continued. So as long as our program is still running, then we can add as many students as we want to this file of information. Now I'm going to close this, and I am going to close the program. I'm just going to stop it altogether. I'm going to shut down my, I won't shut down the code, but I'm going to shut down the screen that's showing the output from the program. Now I'm going to run the program without making any changes to it. So I'm making no changes to the code. I'm just going to run it with F5. And we get the prompt to enter the information, so that comes back again here. And let's just type in some information for some different students this time. Okay, so let's have a student called Pamela Simmons, again, all made up. The street name, let's do 562 Main Street. And what city? Well, how about Gurley? State, Alabama, and zip code is 35748. That information is typed in. It comes back out to the screen as you would expect. And now we're ready to type in data for a different student, which will go to the file. So let's come up with another fake student. So when I type enter, this information will be written to the file. Now, remember what we wrote to the file last time? We had the information for 2 students. We had Susan and we had Phil. Now, let's go look at the file after I've run the program this time. Okay, so let's bring in our file browser. Let's take a look at student.txt. So I'll open it up. Notice what's in the file this time. Okay, we have the information for Pam and for Larson, but what happened to the other two? What happened to poor old Phil and Susan that we had in there before? Well, as I mentioned earlier in this example, if you have an existing file and you open up that file again, which we have done here, let's move these out of the way. We opened up the file again, then it overwrote the existing file, student.txt. So that's one thing you need to be very careful about. When you're opening up a file to write, if you have a file with the very same name, then this write is going to, replace the file that's out there. So you're going to lose what's in this file when you do this. Now, you need to be careful about that. I mean, you can put some protections on this and, make a copy, put it somewhere else. But when you're writing to this place with a W option, that's overwrite mode. So it overwrites an existing file. Now, let's suppose we want to add to the file. So now we can bring in this A mode, this append mode, so we can append to an existing file. So we do not erase the stuff that's in there. So let's change the W to an A. So now we're going to append. So remember we made that change. We had a W, now it's an A. We'll run the program exactly like we did before. Okay, I'm not going to make any other changes to it. And if we want to look at the file, then one more time, here's the file. So this has two students' information in it. We have Pamela, we have Larson. So when I run the program this time, it's not going to erase those two records. It's going to append whatever additional data we have below that. Okay, so let's prove that that does work by running the program again. And I'm going to again pause while I type in the information. So here's the information for Susan. I've typed it all out. I'll just hit the Enter key. And let's move that up so you can see it. So now we have her information printed back to the screen. And now we're prompting for the second student. So I'll again pause while I type in data for a second student, and it's going to be Phil again. So here's the data for Phil Thompson. So I type that in again. Now I'm going to hit Enter, and then the program terminates. So now let's go look at the file. And now look at what we have. So this time, when I've changed the mode from a W to an A, then we add in the existing students, Susan and Phil. We'll add those to the bottom. So now we're appending to the file instead of overwriting it. So that's the other option that you have when you're creating an output file. So this program then gives you a recipe for how to input data from the keyboard and how to write information to an output file. So remember the important things. You have to have the open statement affiliated with a file pointer. When you're reading from the keyboard, you need to use input, and you can use a prompt that will appear on the screen. And when you want to write to an output file, instead of using print, you use the file pointer or handle .write, and then the same stuff that you would normally write when you write to the screen with a print statement. So that part stays the same. Then when you're all finished, you want to close the file with the close statement. So that pretty much summarizes writing data to a file. So we'll stop the video at this point.